She lived at the edge of the village in a small sun-warmed house surrounded by fields that seemed to lean toward her in quiet affection. From the first moment she could walk, her steps were light, and her laughter was like the chime of bells in the breeze, carrying a warmth that made even the grimmest villager pause and smile. She had a natural gentleness that drew people to her, a kindness so profound that animals would follow her, and even the most stubborn children softened in her presence. Her eyes were wide and bright, reflecting an unshakable innocence, and her hands moved with care, always ready to help, to heal, or to comfort. The villagers noticed her kindness early, some with admiration, others with unease. Those who loved her, often older women who had no children or weary farmers who felt the weight of the land, welcomed her gentle spirit. She would help them carry water, repair fences, and tend to animals without complaint. At the market, she would give a little extra of her homegrown produce to those struggling to feed their families, always with a soft word and a modest bow. Her generosity seemed limitless, and yet it was done without expectation of reward, without the need for recognition. Among the children she was a source of joy and guidance. They ran after her in the dusty lanes, laughing as she twirled and danced barefoot, their small hands trying to catch hers. She taught them songs and simple games, stories of the earth, and lessons on kindness and courage. Even the boys, usually rough and competitive, paused to hear her speak, their eyes wide with wonder at her stories of the sky, the wind, and the creatures of the forest. There was something about her presence that commanded both respect and affection, though always wrapped in the softness of her humility. Yet admiration often breeds envy, and there were villagers who could not bear to see her beloved by all. Her virtues, her compassion, and the effortless way she drew people toward her began to stir unease in hearts tainted by fear or jealousy. Some whispered that she possessed powers that were unnatural, gifts that threatened the balance of their ordinary lives. Older, wary villagers muttered about the girl's uncanny ability to soothe the sick or calm frightened animals, saying that her influence was too strong, too otherworldly to be without consequence. They did not see her gentle nature, they saw potential danger in her light. Even within her own home, where she should have felt safest, shadows of mistrust lingered. Some of her kin, threatened by her skill in winning favor and affection, began to distance themselves, speaking sharply or avoiding her gaze. The jealousy was subtle at first, a cold remark, a withheld smile, but it festered, growing heavier with every instance of her unacknowledged generosity. These murmurs, barely audible, could not touch her spirit at first, yet they planted seeds of tension in the delicate fabric of her life. Despite the growing shadows, she remained steadfast in her nature. She would rise each morning with the sun, tending to her small garden, greeting every passerby with a warm nod, and offering a kind word to those struggling under the burden of their days. Her laughter, clear and melodic, continued to ripple through the village lanes, a persistent reminder of her purity and innocence. She took joy in the simple things, a sparrow resting on her shoulder, the bloom of a flower in her garden, the gentle patter of rain on her roof, and these small pleasures became her sanctuary from the undercurrent of envy surrounding her. Her friendships were genuine and unassuming. The baker, whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour, relied on her to deliver bread to the elderly who could not make it to the market. The blacksmith, a burly man with a quick temper, found himself speaking softly when she was near, almost as if her presence tempered the rough edges of his own nature. Even the village healer, an elderly woman long respected for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, saw in her the promise of continuity, a new generation to carry forward wisdom and compassion. Each relationship, built on sincerity, strengthened her place in the village, yet paradoxically, it widened the gap between those who cherished her and those who feared her influence. The girl's innocence, however, was her true strength. She perceived the envious whispers but did not allow them to corrupt her heart. She moved through the village with the same kindness, the same unassuming courage, the same soft smile that had always defined her. Yet, as her light shone brighter, the shadows around her grew darker. People who had once watched her with casual suspicion began plotting in whispers, their imaginations twisted by fear and envy. They saw her every act of generosity as a threat to their own standing, every comforting word as a subtle power over the minds and hearts of the villagers. Even in her quiet solitude, the girl was aware of the tension growing around her. Sometimes she would sit beneath the old fig tree at the edge of her garden, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves, sensing the unease in the air. Her heart ached not from fear of herself but from the realization that goodness could stir hatred, and that her innocence, so pure, so unblemished, might one day become the cause of her suffering. Yet she did not change. She did not retreat into bitterness. She did not allow fear to harden her heart. Instead, she continued to live as she always had, gentle, helpful, and beloved by those who could see her true nature. And so she became a figure of paradox within the village, loved deeply by those who valued kindness, feared and envied by those who could not comprehend such purity. Her presence was a light that could not be dimmed, a gentle force that brought joy to the weary and hope to the oppressed. Yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of malice and jealousy began to conspire, setting the stage for the dark trials she would soon face. Her life, simple in its daily rhythms, carried the weight of a future yet unseen. Every act of compassion, every smile, every word of encouragement was a thread in the tapestry of her legend yet to come, a legend born of innocence, tested by cruelty, and destined to leave an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of all who witnessed it. Her gentle steps echoed in the village lanes, a quiet rhythm that would not be forgotten. The villagers who cherished her counted themselves lucky, unaware that their beloved girl's life, so filled with kindness, was about to be shadowed by envy, fear, and the darker forces of the human heart. Yet even in that looming darkness she remained steadfast, an embodiment of light, gentleness, and innocence in a world increasingly ready to betray her. The whispers began in hushed corners of the village, curling through doorways and over fences like a slow, poisonous wind. At first, they were barely noticeable, soft mutterings about the girl's unusual charm, her uncanny ability to soothe frightened animals, and the way her laughter seemed to carry a light that made even the most hardened villagers pause. Yet as the days passed, the whispers grew bolder, spreading from one wary mouth to another, twisting admiration into fear and respect into envy. Some villagers, unable to reconcile her purity with their own petty ambitions, began to murmur about the dangers of such unbridled goodness, claiming that it threatened the natural order of the village. Among them were elders who prided themselves on knowing the ways of the world, villagers whose hearts had hardened through years of toil and suspicion, and kin who had long felt overshadowed by her innate grace and charm. The elders, particularly, watched her with a wary eye. They recounted old tales of girls blessed, or cursed, with extraordinary gifts, stories where those who seemed innocent brought disaster upon their families and communities. Though their warnings were couched in concern, the venom beneath their words was unmistakable. They suggested to one another that perhaps the girl should be restrained, kept in line, or punished, lest her gifts invite calamity upon the village. The kin, meanwhile, nurtured a more personal grievance. Though she treated everyone with equal kindness, her presence highlighted the mediocrity or selfishness in those closest to her. A sister who had long sought favor in the family, a cousin whose farm struggled while hers flourished under the same sun, and even a distant relative whose petty rivalries were laid bare whenever she entered a room, all felt the sting of inadequacy. Their jealousy festered quietly at first, growing with each smile she offered to others, each act of selflessness that drew admiration from the villagers. They could not accept that she seemed untouched by malice, and so they began to plot. In the shadows plans took shape. Meetings were held in the dead of night, when the moonlight barely illuminated their scheming faces. The conspirators whispered their schemes, careful to avoid prying ears, though some reveled in the thrill of secrecy. The plan itself was simple in design but cruel in execution. The girl, so unassuming and trusting, would be made to suffer in a way that no one would forget. Words were chosen with precision, ideas exchanged with the cold deliberation of those who felt justified in punishing innocence. For the safety of the village, they murmured, though their voices quivered with excitement and malice alike. Fear too fueled their plotting. Each villager had noticed subtle things, how the wind seemed to follow her, how animals fell silent in her presence, how crops thrived under her touch. Some claimed she had enchanted the very earth itself. Though many did not openly believe it, the seed of superstition had taken root. What began as envy became terror. To these villagers, the girl was no longer simply a kind, gentle member of their community. She was an unknown, unpredictable force, a light that cast deep shadows, and a potential threat to their fragile sense of control. Their whispers turned into furtive glances, then nods, then clandestine agreements. The plan evolved beyond mere talk. Villagers agreed to isolate her subtly at first, planting small doubts in her mind, unkind comments disguised as advice, favors withdrawn with excuses, invitations quietly rescinded. It was a gentle push, designed to disorient her without revealing the growing tide of malice. Yet it was enough to unsettle her, to plant faint seeds of confusion and anxiety, which the conspirators watched with careful satisfaction. They felt cunning in their orchestration, pride in their perceived cleverness, Yet beneath it all was a gnawing fear that their plot might falter if her innocence and purity proved too resilient. The kin took a more direct role. They whispered rumors to others, stoking distrust. Tales of the girl speaking to animals in secret, stories of strange occurrences around her home, and fabrications about her intentions toward others. The village, already teetering between admiration and fear, began to tilt toward suspicion. Each whispered story, each sly accusation, was like a grain of sand, slowly shifting the balance toward judgment. The conspirators relished the idea of convincing the community to act, believing that collective fear would ensure their plan succeeded without needing direct confrontation. In the background, the girl continued her life, unaware of the web being spun around her. She went about her tasks, tended her garden, helped the elderly, and cared for the animals, all with the same unwavering kindness. To those who loved her, she remained the light of the village, a constant source of comfort and inspiration. Yet in the silent spaces of the night, where the village whispered behind closed doors, the machinery of cruelty moved inexorably forward. Every murmur, every glance, every secret gathering added weight to the inevitable. As the conspiracy solidified, a plan was proposed that would leave no room for mistake. It was cruel, calculated, and designed to instill fear both in her and in those who might sympathize with her. The conspirators spoke of how she could be restrained, how her influence could be contained, and how the village could be protected from the unknown forces they imagined she carried. Each suggestion escalated in severity, revealing the true depth of their envy and terror. They were no longer merely jealous. They were committed to ensuring that her light was dimmed by whatever means necessary. Thus, beneath the calm exterior of the village, malice pulsed like a hidden current. The girl's innocence, her unwavering kindness, and her bright spirit were admired and cherished by some, yet the envy, superstition, and fear of others conspired against her. The whispered plots took root in shadowed minds, forming a plan that would test her courage, resilience, and spirit. The stage was set, the conspirators ready, and the village itself, unaware of the storm to come, held its collective breath. By the time the girl would become aware of the danger around her, it would be nearly too late. The jealousy had grown into action, the superstition into resolve, and the fear into a calculated threat. In those quiet nights filled with whispered schemes, the conspirators had already begun to shape the fate of the girl, setting the wheels of betrayal into motion with a precision born of malice, envy, and fear. Her innocence, once her greatest strength, now stood in direct opposition to the cruelty festering in the hearts of those who should have protected her. The conspirators had chosen the darkest hour of the night for their cruel act, when the moon barely cast light across the village and most villagers were safely asleep. Only the few who were in on the plot remained awake, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of flickering lanterns. The girl, still unaware of the full extent of their hatred, had been led to a secluded spot under false pretenses, told that she was being taken to a place of honor, a ritual to celebrate her gifts. Her trusting heart betrayed her. She followed them willingly, thinking no ill could come from those she had always treated with kindness. When the clearing came into view, her breath caught. A freshly dug pit yawned in the earth, dark and forbidding, its edges uneven but wide enough to contain her fully. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong, that the air itself was heavy with ill intent. Before she could react, strong hands seized her arms, pulling her forward with an unyielding grip. She struggled, but the men and women who had once called her friend and kin held her fast. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for any sign of mercy, any hint that this could be a mistake, but all she found was cold determination. The villagers, who had plotted this moment in whispers and secret meetings, now revealed their cruelty openly. They forced her into the pit, the damp earth cold against her skin, the smell of soil and stone filling her nostrils. She shrieked, a high, piercing sound that echoed against the trees and startled nearby animals, but no one came to her aid. The very hands that had once guided her steps now worked to ensure she would have no chance of escape. Her body was pressed down by weight, her arms pinned, her feet shackled in crude bindings. Every attempt to resist was met with firm, unrelenting force. As the first shovelfuls of dirt fell against her, terror gripped her heart like icy fingers. She struggled, clawing at the soil, trying to push it away with frantic desperation, but the villagers' resolve was unbreakable. Each handful of earth that covered her was a statement of their cruelty, a demonstration that her innocence meant nothing in the face of their fear and envy. The soil pressed against her chest, against her face, gritty and suffocating, yet she continued to fight with the last reserves of her strength. Her mind raced with disbelief and sorrow. How could those she had loved and helped commit such an atrocity? The gentle hands she had once held in comfort were now instruments of her confinement. Her vision began to blur as dirt filled her eyes and clogged her mouth, choking her breath. The sound of shovels striking the earth above her became a relentless drumbeat, each strike pounding a rhythm of horror into her senses. She wanted to scream, to call for justice, but the dirt muffled her cries, and the weight of betrayal pressed her down further. Above her, the villagers exchanged grim nods and cold smiles, their satisfaction evident. To them, this act was righteous, necessary even, a punishment for a girl whose goodness and grace had unnerved them, whose talents had incited fear and jealousy. Their hearts had convinced themselves that they were protecting the village, that they were ensuring the safety of all by removing this threat. They did not see the humanity they were crushing, nor did they feel the trembling life struggling beneath their hands. She felt the darkness close in around her, the pit now nearly full, leaving only a thin pocket of air to sustain her fragile body. Her lungs burned as she struggled for each gasp, her vision narrowing to tiny specks of light filtering through the loose soil above. Panic clawed at her mind, but even in this extremity, a part of her refused to give in to despair. She thought of the rivers, the trees, the small animals she had nurtured, and a spark of resolve flickered amidst the suffocating darkness. She would survive, somehow, some way she had to. The villagers, confident that their task was complete, began to disperse, leaving the pit covered but not yet tamped fully, believing her buried fate secure. They whispered to one another about how quickly justice had been served, how cruelness could assert control in moments of weakness, and how the village would now be safer. Some laughed quietly, satisfied with the finality of their actions, their malice disguised as virtue. Their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving her alone with the suffocating earth, the heavy silence and the encroaching terror of death. Yet even beneath the weight of soil and betrayal, life persisted stubbornly. Her fingers scraped against the coarse dirt, feeling its texture, measuring its resistance. Her body, though weak and pressed tightly, refused to give up entirely. Thoughts of vengeance mingled with survival. She imagined the faces of those who had wronged her, the hypocrisy of their smiles and the coldness in their eyes. It was not just the need to breathe that kept her moving, it was the desire for justice, for the reckoning that would one day undo the cruelty done to her. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity, the darkness absolute, interrupted only by the faint rumble of the village beyond. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying distant sounds of life, reminding her that the world above continued, ignorant or indifferent to her suffering. The pit became a womb of terror, yet paradoxically, it was also the crucible in which her resolve hardened. The weight of earth pressed not just on her body but upon the seeds of power growing quietly within her, waiting for the moment when her breath would rise again, not just for life but for retribution. Finally, as the last shovel of dirt fell and the villagers' footsteps receded into silence, she was left in total darkness. Every part of her screamed in fear, yet in that pitch-black confinement she felt the first stirrings of a strange energy, a connection to something beyond the mortal realm. The brutality of her burial, the coldness and satisfaction in the eyes of those who condemned her, became the fuel for a fire that would not be extinguished. In the silence of the earth, she realized that she was not yet finished. The injustice done to her would awaken forces that would not rest until balance was restored. Alone, buried alive, terror coursing through every nerve, she lay in the suffocating darkness. Yet even as panic threatened to overwhelm, her mind clung to a singular thought. Those who had buried her alive would one day know the power of the life they had tried to extinguish, and the wind that carried her breath would return as a force they could neither escape nor control. The suffocating darkness pressed in from every side, the soil heavy against her chest, against her trembling limbs. Each breath she drew was shallow, rasping, as though the very air itself had been stolen from her lungs. Panic clawed at her mind, but amid the terror, something strange began to stir. Her inhalations, once ordinary and fragile, carried a subtle warmth, a pulse of energy that seemed almost alive. She gasped, unsure if it was her imagination, and yet the pit itself responded. A faint vibration coursed through the earth, like the heartbeat of the land resonating with her own. Her fingers dug frantically at the damp soil, nails scraping against roots and compacted earth, but the more she struggled, the more she felt the rhythm of life itself coursing through her veins. With each labored breath, the vibrations grew stronger, resonating outward from her body and into the ground above. Tiny grains of soil shivered as if animated by a mysterious force, responding to a power she had not known she possessed. Panic began to mingle with awe. This was no ordinary survival instinct. Something beyond the mortal realm was awakening within her, something the villagers could never have anticipated. As her lungs drew in another desperate gulp of air, the tremors beneath her intensified. Her heart, pounding with fear and exertion, synchronized with the vibrations of the soil. Each pulse sent a ripple outward, subtle at first but insistent, undeniable. She realized that even in her confinement she could influence the world around her. A flicker of hope ignited. Perhaps death would not claim her this night. Perhaps she was meant to rise again, not as a helpless girl, but as something more, something the cruel villagers could never control. Her breaths grew steadier, more measured, yet they carried a strange resonance, a sound that seemed to hum through the earth itself. She could feel it connecting her to the hidden veins of the land, the roots of trees, the buried stones, the very soil beneath her. It was as if the earth itself had taken notice, responding to the injustice inflicted upon her. Each inhalation was no longer merely a struggle to survive. It became an act of awakening, a quiet summoning of forces that had long slumbered beneath the village. She paused for a moment, listening, feeling the vibrations coalesce into a subtle rhythm. The tremors were faint but unmistakable, spreading outward in concentric waves. Tiny stones shifted, roots quivered, and the ground above seemed to breathe in unison with her. It was as though her very existence had begun to claim dominion over the land that had become her prison. Fear was still present, but now tempered by a dawning awareness. She was no longer entirely powerless. There was strength in her breath, power in her persistence, and a whisper of the supernatural weaving itself around her fragile form. Even the darkness seemed different now, less oppressive, more like a cloak that could hide her while nurturing the stirring energy within. She could feel it building, a coiling force beneath her ribs that pulsed outward with every inhalation. Her heartbeat and the earth's response formed a rhythm together, a subtle but potent cadence that hinted at something greater than mere survival. The pit had become more than a grave. It had become a crucible, shaping her fear and pain into a nascent force of nature. Her imagination flickered with visions, shadows moving in the corner of her mind, whispers carried through the trembling soil, a presence watching, guiding. It was the first sign that she was not entirely alone. Whether spirits, forces of the earth, or the collective will of those wronged before her, some consciousness acknowledged her suffering. Each breath she drew now carried weight, meaning, a life-giving power that transcended her mortal frailty. With her next inhalation she felt a surge of energy move from her chest to her fingertips. The soil beneath her trembled more insistently, tiny particles vibrating against her skin. Her fear had not vanished, but it had transformed into determination, the primal will to survive amplified by something inexplicable. The air she breathed, once her enemy, had become an ally, infused with a subtle, supernatural vitality. Her mind began to sharpen despite her exhaustion, aware that this was no ordinary breath. It was a first step, a preliminary act of reclamation. The villagers had intended her death, but instead, they had unknowingly awakened a power that belonged not to them but to her. She could feel the first tendrils of energy linking her to the world above, connecting her suffering to the very earth that had been her prison. As minutes stretched, the tremors became slightly stronger, faint vibrations reaching upward through the layers of soil and roots. She dared to whisper her own name, and the sound seemed to echo in the darkness, absorbed and amplified by the land itself. Hope, fragile but insistent, began to pulse in rhythm with her breaths. She was alive, but more than that, she was stirring something ancient and unstoppable beneath the village. By the time the first hints of moonlight filtered through the loose soil above, she was no longer merely gasping for survival. Her breath had become a force in itself, alive with a supernatural cadence that trembled through the pit, through the roots, through the very heart of the land. The earth, once her tomb, had become the medium through which her presence began to assert itself, a subtle but unmistakable declaration. She was not gone, she would not die quietly, and the wind that carried her life would one day return to sweep through those who had wronged her. The first stirrings of the supernatural wind that had been born from the girl's buried breath reached the village just as dawn began to pale the night sky. At first it was subtle, a faint rustling of leaves, an unusual chill that crept through the thatched roofs and alleyways. But within moments the force intensified, and the villagers sensed immediately that something was wrong. The crops, which had swayed gently in the morning breeze for generations, now quivered violently, as though a colossal hand had seized them and shaken them with deliberate intent. Stalks of maize twisted unnaturally, bending and snapping under the pressure of the invisible force, sending a warning that this was no ordinary wind. Inside their homes, the villagers clutched at beams and doorframes as the roofs rattled violently. The shingles shook loose, pounding against the walls with a thunderous clamor that echoed across the village. Windows vibrated in their frames, rattling in synchronization with the invisible energy that had risen from the girl's buried form. Dust swirled in the air, clinging to faces and hair, making the villagers cough and stumble. Each gust seemed to carry a consciousness, a malice directed specifically at those who had committed the unforgivable act of abandoning her. Panic spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched children to their chests, shielding them from the erratic currents, while men rushed outside to assess the damage, only to be met with the terrifying sight of the crops bending and breaking without any visible cause. Livestock stampeded in confusion, sensing the threat long before their human keepers did. Chickens screeched as they fled their coops, and cows bellowed, their eyes wide with fear. The villagers' hearts pounded in rhythm with the unseen force, a primal terror awakening in their chests. The wind itself seemed to whisper, carrying a sound almost like voices, murmuring just beyond comprehension. Some villagers claimed to hear the girl's faint cries carried within the gusts, her anguish transformed into power. Others swore that the rustling of leaves and rattling of rooftops carried accusations, a spectral judgment of every sneer, every cruel word, every malicious action that had contributed to her abandonment. The village, so long governed by routine and human control, now felt exposed and fragile, powerless against an invisible adversary born from their own sins. Doors slammed open of their own accord, wooden shutters clanged against the sides of homes, and pottery toppled from shelves, shattering against the ground. Each sudden crash drew fresh cries from those who had gathered in the open squares, their eyes darting from trembling beams to the shaking earth beneath their feet. Small children clung to the legs of their parents, their wide eyes reflecting fear that was both primal and prophetic. No one could deny that the forces at play were extraordinary, something otherworldly had risen against them, and it all traced back to the girl they had cruelly left to die. As the wind twisted and roared through the narrow alleyways, the villagers noticed subtle signs of more pervasive destruction. Roof tiles lifted and skittered across the mud paths like startled birds. The central well, a cornerstone of their daily life, trembled, sending ripples through the water that left reflections distorted and unrecognizable. Even the old stone statues that had stood for decades, symbols of the village's heritage, vibrated, their once stoic faces appearing to wince in silent horror. The villagers began whispering to one another, their voices tight with fear, realizing that the girl's vengeance was manifesting in ways far beyond their comprehension. From the edges of the village, the wind intensified further, swirling in columns that tore through the crops and whipped around the corners of homes. Branches of nearby trees bent almost to the ground, leaves torn free and hurled like darts against the thatched walls. Chickens and goats fled en masse, their frantic cries amplifying the chaos, and men and women stumbled as the wind pushed against them, invisible but overwhelming. Every gust carried the invisible imprint of the girl's suffering and anger, a testament to the injustice that had been wrought upon her. Fear hardened in the hearts of the villagers. Long-standing hierarchies and disputes seemed trivial in the face of this unseen retribution. Those who had been loudest in mocking her, those who had taken part in the plot to abandon her, now cowered the most. They recognized, with a sinking horror, that their actions had invited forces they could neither see nor control. Whispers circulated that the girl's spirit had risen, that her breath had become the wind, and that nature itself had chosen to act as her agent. Old men who had seen storms and floods before, admitted that they had never witnessed anything like this. Some attempted to flee to the edges of the village, thinking to escape the invisible tempest, but the wind seemed to follow them, pressing them back toward the central square. Even the paths they had walked 1,000 times now felt treacherous, as if the earth itself was alive and in league with the girl they had wronged. Every footstep became a battle against currents of air that carried both the weight of her suffering and the promise of justice. Children cried aloud, their frightened voices mingling with the moaning of trees and the creaking of buildings. Adults shouted, trying to organize themselves, but coordination fell apart as the wind tore through gatherings, scattering people in all directions. It was impossible to determine where the danger would strike next. Every corner, every rooftop, every shadow seemed imbued with intent. The village was no longer a safe, familiar place. It had become a battlefield between human cruelty and elemental justice. In the midst of the chaos, the villagers could sense a pattern, a silent intelligence behind the destruction. The wind did not harm indiscriminately. Those who had acted out of greed, envy, or malice seemed to feel its pressure more keenly. Doors slammed in their faces, branches scraped along their shoulders, and the very earth beneath them seemed to resist their movement. Survivors began to understand with growing terror that this was no random storm. It was the girl's breath, her spirit, exacting the first measure of retribution for the cruelty they had inflicted upon her. By mid-morning the village was in disarray. Crops lay flattened or broken, rooftops were damaged, livestock scattered, and an unshakable fear settled into the hearts of the people. Each gust of wind reminded them of the girl they had left to die, of the injustice that had been committed, and of the force that now moved in her name. Mothers clutched children, men hid behind walls, and the guilty trembled openly. The unseen yet palpable presence of her breath and power had transformed a peaceful settlement into a place of awe and terror, where every villager knew that the reckoning had only just begun. Nature itself seemed to mourn with and amplify her cause. Birds perched nervously on distant branches, their calls sharp and anxious. Animals ran wild, their instinct sensing the supernatural. Even the sun, rising higher, seemed dimmer, filtered through clouds stirred into unnatural patterns by the persistent force. It was clear to all, the girl left for dead had risen in spirit, and her breath, her very life, had become the first instrument of vengeance that would not be denied. The wind, born of her stolen breath and the injustice of her burial, had grown into a force that no mortal could withstand. At first, it had whispered through the trees, carrying only subtle warnings, but now it roared with a ferocity that shook the village to its very foundations. Those who had plotted her demise, the villagers and kin who had abandoned her, felt it first. The air seemed to coil around them like a living entity, pressing against their bodies, clawing at their minds, and filling their hearts with a fear that was palpable and unrelenting. Branches cracked and groaned under the force of the gusts, and great trees, once sturdy pillars of the village landscape, were ripped from the ground, their roots tearing through the soil as if the earth itself had risen in anger. Each tree that fell struck roofs, walls, and pathways, scattering debris and forcing the guilty to stumble in their desperate attempts to escape. The wind carried not just the sound of destruction, but a tangible sense of purpose. It was not indiscriminate chaos, but calculated, precise retribution. Every gust, every twisting column of air seemed to seek out those who had wronged her, as though guided by an unseen hand. The structures of the village, from modest huts to the larger communal spaces, shuddered under the assault. Thatch roofs lifted, wooden beams splintered, and walls that had stood for decades collapsed with thunderous crashes. Windows shattered, sending shards of glass glittering through the wind, and doors were torn from their hinges, spinning violently before being hurled across the village squares. Smoke and dust filled the air, stinging eyes and making it almost impossible to breathe. Through it all, the guilty ran, stumbling and tumbling as the wind seemed to deliberately block and redirect them, her vengeance in physical form chasing them relentlessly. Those who had not been directly involved in her abandonment watched in terror from hidden corners, powerless to intervene. Mothers clutched children, elders prayed aloud, and young men attempted to rally their strength to protect others, but the wind would not be thwarted. Its path was singular, focused, and inexorable. It tore through the village, twisting the familiar into the unfamiliar, warping the landscape as if the earth itself sought to exact judgment alongside her spectral breath. The guilty ran blindly, slipping on wet mud, tripping over roots and flailing against the invisible force. Their screams echoed, mixing with the howls of the wind, creating a symphony of fear that spread to every corner of the village. Some tried to hide in the remains of buildings, only to have the structures collapse around them, pinning them under debris as the wind mercilessly pursued them. Others climbed trees or sought shelter in wells, but the force of nature, fueled by the girl's breath and the spirit's guidance, left no sanctuary untouched. Animals too responded to the wrath. Birds took frantic flight, scattering in every direction, while goats, chickens, and livestock bolted through the chaos, adding to the confusion and panic. The cries of the animals mingled with the wails of the villagers, creating a cacophony that spoke of the complete and utter domination of natural forces over human will. Even the rivers and streams, previously calm, swelled and churned as the wind's fury seemed to reach into the water, carrying branches and debris in turbulent eddies that mirrored the terror on land. From the heart of the village, where the girl had been buried, the wind seemed to emanate as a visible force. Dust, leaves, and loose earth swirled into spiraling columns, glowing faintly as if lit from within by the girl's lingering spirit. Each gust carried a sense of her presence, her rage, her sorrow, and the justice that had been denied her in life. Those responsible for her suffering felt it in their bones, a pressure that bent their knees and made their lungs ache, a spiritual weight that forced them to acknowledge the magnitude of their crime even as they fled. The wind tore through homes with precision, as if guided by her memory of betrayal. Roofs were ripped apart, walls splintered and furniture scattered across the open squares. The guilty attempted to take refuge in cellars or behind large stones, but the air itself seemed to penetrate any barrier. Dust choked their mouths, leaves whipped at their faces, and every shadow seemed to twist and flicker with an ominous sentience. They realized with growing horror that this was not a natural storm. The girl they had thought dead had returned through the simplest and most elemental part of life itself. Her breath transformed into judgment. Some tried to escape beyond the village, fleeing toward the hills or the surrounding forests. Yet the wind followed them relentlessly, bending trees across paths, uprooting undergrowth to block escape, and creating barriers that forced them back toward the ruins of the village. Each step they took was met with increasing resistance, a lesson that nature, guided by the injustice done to her, would not allow them freedom. The air seemed almost alive, a sentient avenger moving with intent and precision. Amid the chaos, the few who had been innocent witnesses could only stare in terror and awe. They saw the guilty thrown to the ground, trapped by the wind or crushed under falling debris, their cries for mercy ignored. They felt the raw power of retribution, realizing that the girl's survival had been more than miraculous, it had been a herald of justice. They trembled not only for their own safety but for the understanding that the natural and supernatural worlds had joined to punish wrongdoing. By midday the village lay in ruins. Thatched roofs were demolished, walls splintered, and the once orderly paths were littered with debris and uprooted trees. The guilty were scattered, many injured, some clinging desperately to life, all humbled before the elemental vengeance they could neither predict nor escape. Fear, awe, and trembling respect settled over the survivors. The wind, once a subtle messenger, had become the unstoppable instrument of her wrath, demonstrating that cruelty exacted consequences and that her stolen life now demanded reckoning. In the aftermath, even the landscape bore witness. The village, scarred and altered, seemed to carry the memory of her breath in every broken tree, every collapsed wall, and every scattered object. Survivors whispered among themselves, acknowledging that the girl's wrath had not been mindless but precise, targeting only those who had participated in her suffering. The wind, born of injustice, had swept through the village, leaving nothing untouched and teaching a lesson in fear, humility, and respect that would endure for generations. From the edges of the devastation, faint currents continued to stir, hinting that the girl's breath, the wind she had become, remained ever watchful, ensuring that her vengeance was complete and her message eternal. Cruelty to the innocent summons forces beyond human control, and those forces will pursue justice with relentless, elemental power. Those who had not participated in the girl's suffering, those who had remained kind, compassionate, or simply innocent bystanders, found themselves untouched by the whirlwind of destruction. As the wind tore through the village with relentless fury, it seemed to carry an innate sense of discernment, sparing those whose hearts had remained pure and whose hands had caused no harm. Children, mothers, and elders who had merely watched from a distance now felt the wind swirl around them with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with its devastation elsewhere. The gusts that could lift roofs and uproot trees softened as they passed over these innocent souls, wrapping them in a protective embrace rather than crushing them under their force. Those spared could hardly comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. As debris fell around them and structures collapsed nearby, they remained unharmed as if invisible shields had been cast around them. The subtle shifts in the wind seemed almost sentient, pausing, bending, and curling away to avoid causing injury. The spared villagers began to understand that the destruction had been targeted, deliberate, and controlled. This revelation instilled a profound mix of relief, awe, and fear within them. They realized that the girl's power was guided not by mindless vengeance but by an acute moral judgment that had spared the blameless. Parents clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks, and the elderly bowed their heads in silent reverence. Survivors who had once mocked or envied the girl now trembled not only for their own lives but at the realization that justice could operate through forces far beyond human understanding. Even as their homes crumbled and their neighbors fell to the wind's fury, those untouched could feel the lingering presence of the girl in every stirring breeze, an omnipresent reminder that cruelty was never without consequence. The wind itself seemed to communicate a lesson. Innocence is not ignored or overlooked, and even the most destructive retribution is tempered by fairness. It moved with purpose, carefully distinguishing between the guilty and the innocent, ensuring that punishment did not descend indiscriminately. Observers noted how the current seemed to skirt around clusters of people who had shown kindness or had avoided taking part in the girl's torment. A mother who had quietly offered bread to the girl during her suffering felt the wind curl protectively around her, a reassurance that her small act of compassion had not gone unnoticed. Animals too seemed to sense the distinction. Domestic livestock fled the areas of destruction but avoided those who had remained innocent, seeking shelter nearby or huddling close to the spared villagers. Birds, startled by the chaotic gusts, circled overhead, occasionally alighting near the unharmed, their presence oddly calming. Even the earth itself seemed to soften beneath the feet of the innocent, cushioning their steps amidst the upheaval that had overtaken the guilty. As the chaos subsided, a profound silence fell over the village. Dust settled, structures lay in ruin, and the cries of the injured diminished into weak whimpers. The spared villagers began to assess the aftermath, recognizing that they had survived not by luck but by virtue of their own integrity and the impartial hand of justice that the girl, now transformed into a force of elemental power, had wielded. A collective understanding settled over them. Cruelty provokes retribution, but virtue can shield one from its full force. Those who had been spared were left to rebuild their lives with the weight of this lesson pressing upon them. They spoke in hushed tones of the girl who had been buried alive, whose breath had become the wind of vengeance, and how that wind had spared them while decimating the wicked. Each survivor carried a newfound respect for the balance between human morality and supernatural justice, knowing that acts of cruelty were never invisible and that innocence was not only recognized but protected. In the days that followed, the spared villagers became silent witnesses to the girl's enduring power. They could feel her presence in every gentle breeze that rustled the trees, every stirring of leaves along the broken streets, and every calm gust that swept over the ruins. The lesson was clear. The wind had destroyed the guilty, yet it had honored the innocent, emphasizing that justice is precise, purposeful, and inherently fair. Their survival was a testament to the girl's discernment, a reminder that even in the face of immense power and wrath, fairness and protection could coexist with punishment. The story of the spared villagers spread through whispers and tales, a cautionary narrative intertwined with awe. Children grew up hearing of the wind that tore through the village yet spared the blameless, and adults carried the memory as a moral guide. Those untouched by the girl's vengeance emerged humbled, reflective, and forever aware of the fine line between cruelty and kindness. The wind's selective fury ensured that her legacy was not one of indiscriminate terror but a careful, enduring balance. Justice tempered by mercy, destruction tempered by protection, and fear tempered by the understanding that innocence would always endure. The village lay in smoldering silence, a landscape of devastation that once had been full of life and laughter. Homes were reduced to piles of splintered wood and ash, their charred remains a stark reminder of the catastrophic power that had been unleashed. Roofs had collapsed, walls had crumbled, and familiar paths that had led children to school or elders to market were now unrecognizable, twisted by the force of the wind that had risen from the girl's buried breath. Smoke curled in lazy spirals toward the sky, mingling with the faint scent of scorched earth, and the occasional gust carried the remnants of leaves, loose debris, and whispers of the chaos that had passed. It was a scene of utter ruin, and yet in its midst life had not been entirely extinguished. Survivors wandered the wreckage, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Mothers clutched their children, trembling as they stepped over shattered furniture and splintered floors. Fathers, who had once stridden confidently through the village, now moved like ghosts, their hands shaking as they touched the remnants of their homes. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of a burning thatch or the soft sobs of someone mourning what had been lost. It was a silence that weighed on the soul, forcing each survivor to confront the enormity of what had occurred and the lesson that had been delivered with relentless precision. Among the ruins, the guilty were not simply afraid, they were humbled. The villagers who had once plotted against the girl, or who had indulged in mockery, cruelty, or envy, could feel the weight of their actions pressing down upon them. Every ruined home, every toppled tree, and every bent fence became a living testament to their misdeeds. Their fear was not merely for their personal safety but for the undeniable truth that the girl's power had been both measured and moral. Justice had been delivered, and it had left an indelible mark on the fabric of the village. As the survivors slowly assessed the damage, the lesson became painfully clear. Cruelty, whether born of jealousy, superstition, or fear, carried consequences that could not be ignored or escaped. The girl's suffering had transformed into a force of nature, and that force had left no ambiguity. Injustice, when inflicted upon the innocent, exacts a price that reverberates beyond human comprehension. Those who had participated in her torment could no longer claim ignorance, nor could they deny the reckoning that had been delivered. The village itself had become a living example of the consequences of malice, its ruined streets and broken homes etched into memory as proof of the power of righteous vengeance. Even those who had not directly harmed her were affected. They walked among the ruins with hearts heavy, understanding that the delicate balance of life and justice had been tested and enforced. They had witnessed a force that spared the innocent while punishing the guilty, and that knowledge settled deep within them. Gratitude mixed with fear for the girl's presence, and the wind that had risen from her buried form, was still felt in subtle ways, a breeze that stirred the remnants of burned leaves, a soft rustle among the broken structures, a whisper that carried the weight of her judgment. The survivors had been marked by this experience, not through physical harm but through a profound understanding of justice and consequence. In the aftermath, conversations were hushed and reverent. Elders recounted what had occurred, ensuring that the story would survive, passed from one generation to the next. Children, though young and frightened, began to understand that actions born of cruelty could summon consequences far beyond human control. Even as the villagers set about clearing debris and attempting to rebuild, the landscape itself served as a constant reminder. The price of envy, fear, and malevolence is immeasurable, and the power of innocence, once wronged, is unstoppable. The village's social fabric had been irrevocably altered. Those who had survived were no longer the same people who had ignored or contributed to cruelty. Humility replaced arrogance, compassion replaced callousness, and a wary respect for forces beyond their comprehension became a guiding principle. Communities that once prioritized status, reputation, and petty grievances now had an acute awareness of the weight of their actions. Every decision, every judgment, every moment of cruelty or kindness was viewed through the lens of the lesson that had been carved into their hearts by the girl who had been buried alive and whose breath had risen as a wind of justice. The physical ruin was mirrored by an emotional and spiritual transformation. Survivors found themselves reflecting on their own behaviors, questioning past injustices, and pledging to protect rather than harm. Fear remained, but it was tempered by understanding, a realization that they had witnessed not chaos, but the meticulous and purposeful retribution of one who had suffered unjustly. The wind had not merely destroyed, it had instructed, guiding them to recognize the consequences of envy, cruelty, and neglect. As the days passed and the initial shock began to fade, the village remained forever altered. Homes were rebuilt, but the memory of the girl and the wind that had torn through their lives was never forgotten. Each gust of air, each trembling leaf, and each sudden shadow reminded them of the lesson. Cruelty is never inconsequential, and the forces of justice, whether human, spiritual, or elemental, will always find a way to restore balance. The ruins, though partially reconstructed, remained a sacred testament to both destruction and moral reckoning, ensuring that the story of the girl who had been buried alive and whose breath became the wind would endure as a haunting, instructive legend for generations to come. By the time the village had regained a semblance of normalcy, the fear and respect for what had transpired were ingrained in every villager's heart. No one dared to forget, no one dared to deny the power that had swept through their homes and lives. And though the girl herself had vanished from sight, her presence lingered in every trembling leaf, in every whisper of wind, in every moment of reflection that reminded the villagers that justice, when born of innocence wronged, is both unavoidable and eternal.